Hi, sorry for the delay. My name is Manika. I work with the Asia Society, and thank you all for coming for today's program. I'd like to introduce Ms. Tasneem Mehta to give the opening remarks, Director of the ʔAːj.aːŋ Museum, and she's also on our Advisory Council for Asia Society.
Good evening, friends. It's wonderful to see such a full house this evening. It's my privilege to welcome you here on behalf of the Asia Society for this, what is going to be, I think, a very stimulating and engaging lecture by Navina Najat Haider on Opulence and Fantasy, Sultans of Deccan, India. Navina is Curator, Department of Islamic Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she will give us an overview of the art of the Deccan period. I would also like to thank Christie's for supporting this program and the National Gallery of Modern Art, who is our venue partner, and our outreach partner, the Cambridge Society of Bombay. I'd like to just say a few words about Navina, whom I have known for many, many years as a young child, in fact. And it's wonderful to see what heights she's scaled now. Navina has been curator at the Met's Department of Islamic Art since 1999. She has helped lead the planning of the museum's galleries for the art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia, which is the name of the Islamic galleries, which have welcomed more than 1.5 million visitors since they opened in November 2011. She has contributed to the Metropolitan Museum's art timeline of art history, its website, its gallery lectures, teacher training workshops, international institutional exchanges, and has contributed significantly to efforts towards art education. I would like to invite Navina now to give her presentation.
Good evening, friends. It's a great honor to be here in Bombay, in the Deccan, speaking about the Deccan, a subject that I've worked on for many years in collaboration with my colleagues at the Met. I'd like to start by thanking Asia Society very warmly for this wonderful invitation to be here and share our work with you. I'd also like to thank Tasneem Mehta for the very kind introduction. And I'd like to just say again how delighted I am to be in Bombay. I've been working also with the Deccan Heritage Foundation, who have helped me with various aspects of research, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them as well. So I have been a curator at the Metropolitan Museum for quite a long time, and I've had an opportunity to work on the arts of the Islamic world in all of its entirety, in one sense, because our collection there is very deep and rich, and being able to work on objects that start in the Umayyad period, the first dynasty of Islam, all the way across the Arab world, Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, and Southern Asia. And for me, coming to the Deccan, to look at the Deccan with all that I was able to look at before really working on the Deccan, was especially fascinating because I found that the Deccan was a meeting point for so many traditions that extended all the way across the Islamic world, influences that came as far as the Western Mediterranean, influences that came in from Africa, from Europe, different parts of the Middle East. Oops. Excuse me. And it became apparent during the years of research that the Deccan was not just a world in itself, contained in the way that we see it today, contained within national boundaries or regional boundaries, but in its time, you could argue that the Deccan in many ways was a pivot for world globalization. It attracted many, many people from across the world. And the place that they came to, especially Europeans after the so-called Age of Discovery dawned in the late 15th century, most people were heading towards the southern part of India and towards the Deccan, the northern south. So this incredible feeling that the Deccan was the key to so much of world history and world art and the world of ideas and the world of artistic expression was one of the things that made it incredibly exciting to work on. Not least also because the quality of the works of art that were produced at the Deccan courts between the late 15th and end of the 17th century are, in terms of their quality and in terms of their artistic merit, some of the most extraordinary works of art produced anywhere. So that sort of journey into high quality, into great ideas, into extraordinary artistic expression is what I'm hoping to share with you this evening through the medium of an exhibition that we did at the Metropolitan Museum on the arts of the Deccan Sultans, which took place last year in 2015, and which got fantastic reviews because most people just fell in love with these wonderful objects and paintings that we'll be looking at today. So I just wanted to really start by expressing my enthusiasm for all things Deccan and to share that with you over the next period of time. I'm just getting used to this clicker. I'm going to start really with a map, which is always a useful way to look at the world, but I'm also always keen to point out that maps have their limitations. We tend to take a bird's eye view of a region, which in its own time didn't have a bird's eye view of itself in the same way. And while we look at space from this kind of objective position, we must also remember that topography and the things, the sort of landscape that human beings saw in front of their eyes actually dictated a lot of the cultural exchanges and the sort of reality that they lived in. And that's something that is kind of an exciting area to think about, and we're actually working on new types of maps that show topography, landscapes, water bodies, as well as these sort of objective views that you can see here. But if you were to look at this map, you'd see that closer to me there's a map that shows the Deccan region of India and the southern part of India in about the late 15th century, really just before the period that we're speaking about. I'm sorry, I'm still learning. Okay, there we are. So there is the Indian subcontinent. This area that you're looking at here are the boundaries of the Bahmanid Empire, and below that area is the territory of the Vijayanagar Empire. And these two great empires shared a boundary, shared a border, and they also enjoyed many cultural exchanges and were the two great powers that controlled southern India. Certainly by the late 15th century, they were sort of well established in there, in fact, sort of coming to a kind of end position. Especially the Bahmanids, because this large territory eventually broke up into 5 individual states that dominated the Deccan from the early 16th to the end of the 17th century, when they were eventually conquered by the Mughals of the north. And if you look at this map here, you'll see what happened after the breakup of the Bahmanid Empire. That area now is controlled by 5 separate political entities or kingdoms. They are Bijapur, Golconda, Bidar, Berar, and Ahmednagar. And above them is the mighty Mughal Empire, which has been bearing down on this region since about 1620 onwards, hell-bent on conquering it. And as I said, they eventually succeeded at the end of the 17th century when Aurangzeb finally captured the forts of Bijapur and Golconda in 1686 and 1687. But what happened to the south of them? The south is also a very important history as far as the Deccan Sultans are concerned, because in 1565, these 5 kingdoms were able to form an alliance, a collaboration, by which they defeated the neighboring Vijayanagar Empire and seized a great deal of territories, but especially from the northern Vijayanagar area, which is why they were able to expand beyond the boundaries of what the Bahmanids had originally expanded to. And that is the famous Battle of Talikota, which resulted in the expansion of the Sultanate territories and the defeat of the Vijayanagar Empire, which had a sort of renaissance, you could say in some sense, under the Nayaka rulers, which followed after them. But that's just a brief snapshot of the history of the period. And we, just as a kind of by staying with the idea of a background, let's just look at what the Bahmanid period has to offer in terms of art objects and what the surviving artistic legacy of the Bahmanid period is. Now, you'd be surprised if I told you there were barely 5 or 10 objects in the world, secular objects, that could actually be attributed to the Bahmanid period. In fact, as a great mystery of Indian art, there's hardly any quantity of secular household, small portable objects that exist, especially even metalwork, before the 15th century. Now, there are some exceptions, and in fact, the Prince of Wales Museum here has a very distinguished collection of metalwork that was excavated in a place called Kolur, and it has been dated to the late 13th, 14th century, and that's an important body of material that we do think about, and there are other exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, it's a big question. You have plenty of metalwork statues from temples and idols that survive in the context of temples, but in terms of the kind of metalwork traditions you would find, for example, in the Middle East that go back all the way to the 7th century, 6th century, non-stop record of metalwork production, we don't have that same huge amount of quantity in that period, and that's a mystery. So when we were working on the Bahmanid period, we had to sort of very objectively look at it and try to come up with something for that period. There is, of course, a tremendous legacy of architecture from the Bahmanid period, and this wonderful facade that you see here is from the madrasa of Mahmud Gawan, who was an Iranian prime minister in the service of the Bahmani Sultans, and who introduced, along with many other people of his type, Persian tastes and Persian techniques in the artistic expression and tastes in the Deccan. So you see up here a fantastic calligraphic facade with blue and white and 2 shades of blue ceramic tiles, and that is just typical for Iranian and Central Asian architecture, but very rare in Indian architecture, especially in that style that you can see quite clearly defined, and that is the whole complex. So the complex of Mahmud Gawan is an important piece of evidence for the kind of tastes and styles that were introduced in the Bahmani period. But what objects would have been associated there? We hardly know. On the subject of Middle Eastern influences, you can see that in the Bahmani period, there are also some other wonderful pieces of evidence in architecture that help us think about objects and decorative arts. This is the interior of a Bahmanid period tomb from Ashtur, which is where the Bahmanid Sultans were buried, close to the tomb of Khalilullah, who was an Iranian saint to whom they had given refuge and who was their spiritual leader. And you can see that the decoration of this tomb, which is extraordinary for its wall painting program, actually has the kinds of medallion forms that you see in some of these areas that resemble those great famous medallions on the star Uşak carpets of Turkey. Uşak was a center of textile and carpet production in Turkey, and it's distinguished by this medallion sort of so-called black star motif. But in fact, Helen Phelan, in her scholarship on the subject, has shown that this design actually appears in the tomb of Ahmad Shah before it appears in the carpets of Turkey. Now, I'm just updating you as we go along with the kind of new scholarship that's coming up on the Deccan, because there's a lot been happening for the last few years. My aim is to not so much give you an academic sort of in-depth look at one particular topic, but to really give you a survey of this kind of sweep of traditions and bring you up to date with some of the new ideas that are coming up in the field. And so that's sort of what I'm doing, just to keep you apace. And here you see a very interesting thing that we were able to do in the exhibition, and that scholarship specifically by Philip Wagner has been showing, is that in this period, the Bahmanid period, the Bahmanid Vijayanagar period, one way that you can actually show exchanges is through coinage, because Bahmanid coins, which you see up here, were struck in Arabic and took the name of the ruler and took the standard Arabic formulaic inscriptions, were actually, these are a pair of Bahmanid coins, and these are a pair of Vijayanagar coins. If you look carefully, you can see that there are deities seated there, and the script that you see actually is Nagari script. It's not Arabic script, obviously. But the interesting thing that Wagner's research has been showing is that the Bahmanid coins were in circulation in the Vijayanagar Empire and held a 7 to 1 times value over the Vijayanagar coinage, which is an interesting link because it means that there were economic ties between these two kingdoms, despite the kind of history of, territorial conflict that they had. Down here are the famous elephant stables at Hampi, which actually show Bahmanid-style dome structures above them. So that's another way in which you can see the influence between the two, the exchanges between the two. So I've just given you a little bit of the background of the Bahmanid period. I've given you this idea about mysteries that remain. I encourage those of you who ever want to think about being collectors to try and find areas to collect in that haven't been touched before. And if you're right here in the Deccan, in the southern part of India, it would be amazing if somebody actually applied themselves seriously to thinking about Bahmanid and, for that matter, Vijayanagar metalwork, and maybe trying to do the impossible, which is to identify groups of material that can be attributed to these periods and start maybe collecting, expanding our understanding of that. But let's look then at what happened next. And here we are in the Deccan after the 5 governors of the Bahmanid period have each seized independence, declared independence, and seized large pieces of territories. And they are, as I mentioned, the names of the territories, but each of the governors has their own lineage, their own titles, and so they're known as the Adil Shahi dynasty of Bijapur, the Qutub Shahi dynasty of Golconda, the Barid Shahis, the Imad Shahis, and the Nizam Shahis. These are the sort of dynastic names of the region. And you can see how they've spread themselves over here. Now, as we talk about this period, I'd like us to imagine it not along the lines, clear lines of dynastic boundary, but let's try to imagine this, because we're really talking about the movement of art and ideas. Let's try to imagine this as a series of circles, almost, circles of influence, circles of art patronage that often overlap with each other and create mixtures and influences that go across the lines of dynasty and across the lines of boundary, because that's really actually what happened. Boundaries and political definitions are useful, but only up to a point, and sometimes they can actually take us in the wrong direction if we make them too inflexible. So what I'm going to propose now is for us to look at the region in the following way. We will look at the patronage of the first circle, which is the sultans themselves, of the powerful courts of the Deccan. We will look at another tradition associated with the Marathas, who were rising up as a force in the western part of India at this time, and who came into their own at the very end of the 17th century. We will also be looking at the role of Europeans who were, as I mentioned in the very beginning, on their way to the Deccan and to southern India. And in this map, you'll see all these little outposts all along here, which indicates the positions where the following forces had all established themselves through the course of this period. The Portuguese, who conquered Goa in 1510, that's up there. The French, who are on the eastern coast, slightly later and more power. The Dutch, who were down, the Danes and the Dutch, who are also on this coast. And then the English, who moved in various positions, but were mostly here on this coast as well. So already I've mentioned 5 European powers. You also have extraordinary little deviations from the known 5 powers. For example, the memoirs of Nikitin, who was a Russian horse merchant who came to the Deccan in the 15th century during the Bahmanid period and left a very short account of life in the Deccan. It's a very important source. But he was a Russian agent, horse seller, in the middle of the Deccan in the 15th century. So it's very interesting to keep all of that in mind. I guess the last influence I would mention is that from Africa, but we're going to see that through the paintings as we go ahead. So looking at the world of the sultans themselves, we're looking at the extraordinary kingdom of Ahmednagar. Right up north on the western Deccan, under massive pressure from the Mughals, from the very beginning almost, home to, well, some of the most rare and fragmentary remains of Deccani art emerged from this region. But we're looking at an image here of the tomb of one of the most powerful figures that's associated with Ahmednagar, and that is the brilliant general, African general, Malik Ambar. Now, in our exhibition, we were very lucky to get what we think is the earliest portrait of Malik Ambar, a real portrait of him, as opposed to the copies that were also circulating at the time. And this famous picture, which is an allegorical picture made by his sworn enemy, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who in 1618 had a dream that he lobbed off the head of Malik Ambar, impaled it on a golden spear, was handed arrows by divine cherubs in the skies, golden arrows by which he further projected into the decapitated head. Unfortunately for him, that was all a dream. Malik Ambar lived on to 1626, but this is a very interesting development in the Jahangir period of these wish-fulfilling allegorical paintings that were produced by court artists for him. Now, just a word about Malik Ambar. You might have heard his name. He's very well known in this part of the world and now around the world, because there have been two new biographies that have been written of Malik Ambar. One by Richard Eaton. Actually, it's an essay in a wonderful book called 8 Indian Lives, which gives you a biographical account of 8 figures of history from this part of the world. And the other one by Omar Ali, who's a new scholar and young scholar, and has just produced something in Oxford series of very short biographies. I really recommend them both because the life of Malik Ambar is one of the most extraordinary life stories anywhere in the world. He was born as a poor African boy, and he rose to become an Indian king, essentially. And that incredibly moving personal narrative is a mirror and a key, really, to the forces that took him across the Indian Ocean, that helped elevate him to a powerful position, and that became a key. His life is a key, really, to understanding the larger cultural context of the Deccan and of the Muslim world, actually, at this time. I'm just going to... Yep. So here's a close-up of the painting that I discussed earlier on. There's Jahangir. This painting is by Abul Hasan, one of the great Mughal artists of his time, and you can see how he has imagined Malik Ambar, his head decapitated, and you can see 2 owls, actually, one above his head and one that's dead, its mate that's dead below his head. This whole picture, as I said, is an allegorical picture because every single thing in here has a symbolic meaning. But essentially, Malik Ambar is equated with the forces of darkness and night, and Jahangir is associated with the forces of goodness and light, and the two have met in this epic clash. But what you must know is that Malik Ambar defended Ahmednagar against Mughal incursions until his death in 1626, and his rise as a slave who came to Ahmednagar and rose to this great figure is one of those amazing stories of history that I've just mentioned. Staying with Ahmednagar, after the time of Malik, from Ahmednagar also, we have the foundational painting, manuscript of painting that comes in this period. And this is the famous Tarif-e-Hussain Shahi, which is presently in Pune, in a place called the Bharat Itihas Shamshodhak Mandal. And we had hoped to be able to borrow it for the exhibition. Sadly, it was promised to us and then not sent for various reasons. I won't go into them here, but it is an absolutely foundational document for the period because this is the earliest dated work or datable work from the Deccan as a painting style. And it was commissioned by Hussain Nizam Shah, who was one of the 5 sultans who actually fought at the Battle of Talikota. He held a very important position in terms of the strategy, and when this coalition won the battle, he felt particularly proud for his role as a general. And you see him here, that's Hussain Shah, in a garden with women being attended on by women. And this is the text that really describes, by a court artist in his court, who describes his achievements and describes him as a great, perfect king and so on. And this is important, as I said, for his painting style, which you can see is this wonderful, already the Deccan palette, which we love and admire so much and is so unique to the Deccan, comes in this early work. The pale pink, the blues, the mauves, it's very Indian, and yet it's very foreign in one sense. And that's because it really is a very fresh moment of the meeting of Indic styles where space is flattened and figures are simplified and they're often arranged in sort of linear narrative form, with this kind of taste of Persia that's coming in for lighter colors, moving away from the reds and blacks that you would see in other sorts of paintings, northern Indian paintings at this time, and introducing a whole new freshness to the color palette, and absolutely delightful scenes just designed to enhance your visual experience looking at that, and very different from what happens slightly later when this figure, who's one of the later kings of Ahmednagar, comes to the throne. He is thought to be either Murtaza, who was known as the Mad. He was a sort of very colorful character who ruled Ahmednagar in the 1560s, or Burhan the Second, who is another king who ruled for 5 years from 1591 to 95, and who served at the Mughal court and introduced a lot of Mughal influence in the styles of painting. But before we get too much into Mughal influence, I think I should just point out a couple of things stylistically, because really as an art historian, what I'm interested in, what we try to do is document the chronology of style, the visual expression, the line, every little achievement on the piece of paper that's stylistic is the key to the story here. We try not to make art an illustration of history, but history is really a tool for us to be able to contextualize the art in. So style is all important to art historians who are trained like me. And so for me, I see something that goes from here to here that has survived, and that is the monumentality of the human form. If you look at Persian painting, the human form tends to be very small and often set in very complex settings. But here you can see that there is an Indic or an Indian sort of aesthetic at work here, where the human form is actually monumentalized and centrally placed. You also see here, I talked about the flatness, the kind of linear style, but here you see there's shading, modeling, a sense of volume. These are all new innovations for the artist who we know, who is known as the Paris painter, because this is his masterpiece in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. So you're beginning to see a stylistic change from the 1560s when this was made to possibly the 1590s when that was made. I say possibly because we haven't quite yet figured out whether it is Burhan Nizam or his ancestor Murtaza, his father actually Murtaza. Another thing that I found very interesting to read, and I'd recommend it again to those of you who are interested in the period, is the work done by a scholar called Daud Ali, who's been looking at the traditions of medieval Hindu kingship. And reading his scholarship, one realized that a fundamental change had taken place, or appeared to have taken place, in court practice from these two paintings. Here you see that the king is being attended on by women. Here you see that the courtiers around the king are male. And this really is a very medieval Hindu idea that goes back to the idea of a divine king, almost a Krishna-like figure who's surrounded by women attendants. And the big shift in court practice that happens under Mughal influence is what you might be seeing in the later period. We pointed this out as an important transition in our catalogue. So leaving behind Ahmednagar, I've just given you a little flavor. We're now moving to the kingdom of Bijapur, which was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Deccan at the time and had a huge territory on the western Deccan. This is a picture of the Jama Masjid, which is a very, very elegant building in Bijapur and has this wonderful gesso-painted mehrab or prayer niche. And Bijapur, as I mentioned, was under the reign of the powerful Adil Shahi Sultans. And you're looking here at one of the most important early patrons of painting. The very earliest sultans, we don't have much evidence of painting surviving or art surviving from their times. But we do begin to see art from the time of Ali Adil Shah I, who was the father of Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who was this great figure of Bijapur who you might have all heard about. Now, what's interesting about Ali is that he also served at the Battle of Talikota. And you see him here in a portrait that we were able to borrow from the David collection that shows him wearing a very unusual type of dagger in his belt. It's a kind of a figural-looking hilt, which resembles somewhat the hilt of that dagger there, which is also in the David collection. They actually were able to acquire both the works together and possibly unite them. And I have a close-up to show you this extraordinary type of dagger that you only find in the southern part, actually only in the Deccan. And there's actually only 2 or 3 types of daggers that are quite in this style. What you're looking at here is a gold-hilted, is a hilt, sort of made of, originally made of copper, but then gilded over with gold, over a watered steel blade. But if you look carefully, you can see the iconography. And it's worth dwelling just for a moment on the iconography of this dagger hilt. You see that there's a lion figure who is crushing or subduing an elephant in his claws. And underneath, it's a little hard to see, but there is a snake, a dragon who is subduing a phoenix bird, and that sort of winds around the bottom. And there are 2 phoenix birds whose wings are spread out. You can see one there and one there. So what is this extraordinary iconography? What does it mean? That's a big puzzle, because one tradition seems to come from India, the idea, especially South India, the idea of an elephant subduing a lion. The lion is, of course, the symbol of royalty in India from ancient times. And the elephant, powerful as it may be, is often shown in a quite subservient role in South Indian architecture. Think of the temple in Ellora. The elephants are pulling the temples on their back. The elephants are serving. Dominating the elephant is the role of the lion. In northern India, you tend to see the elephant sort of in a more powerful position quite often in sort of art in general. I think it's a very southern Indian sensibility where the elephant is in service. But this iconography, this royal iconography, is meeting what is essentially a Persian iconography, the dragon and the phoenix, whose pictorial origins go back to the art of China, came into Iran and Central Asia, probably after the Mongol invasion of 1258, and then have meandered all the way into India. So what an extraordinary long journey these motifs have made. How has their meaning and symbolism changed over time? What did it mean to the Deccan Sultans to have a dagger with this particular image? And is it possible that this dagger was actually a Vijayanagar dagger that was conquered and given to Ali Adil Shah at the Battle of Talikota, after the Battle of Talikota? That's one of the theories about it, which we are still, thinking about. Now, this was one of my favorite objects that we managed to borrow in the exhibition. It's a gauntlet sword, which shows that same kind of imagery. You see, it's a lion, essentially, and this would have been a sort of gauntlet. It would cover the front of your arm and have a very long extension going, a pata type of weapon. It's lost its blade, but you can see how lively and fantastic and strong the sculptural qualities of the gauntlet, the arm cover are. And the best part is the tail, I think, that would have risen up just above your arm. And you can see that this lion is also crushing elephants in its jaws. It's the same idea. You see, I have a close-up here. A little bit of the original gilding remains on this piece, but it was a very exciting piece because we've never seen anything quite like it before. And of course, it also relates to the famous Malik-e-Maidan cannon that was cast in Ahmednagar in 1549 and moved to Bijapur slightly later. That shows the same influence. And just to add a twist to the plot, we know that the person who created this cannon was an Ottoman armorer, in service of the Nizam Shahis of Ahmednagar. So I hope you're beginning to see how the great cultural and artistic achievements and technical achievements of the Deccan involved the participation of many different foreigners who became part of the cultural mix in the Deccan and weren't really considered foreign. They were considered brilliant, and their services were called upon by the rulers. Moving on, we're going to just look at some other works from the period of Ali Adil Shah. We have the famous Nujum al-Ulum manuscript, which shows the 7-stepped throne of the Hindus, the Simha. I'm now a little jet-lagged, but there's a specific term for the 7-step throne. And you can see that it ends up with the ruler on top and the whole world around him. And those little leonine figures are expressed also in an open work axe, which was another fantastic piece. Now, what's interesting about the axe is that you see that it's got the kind of lion, the dominant lion element, and a double-headed eagle, but it also has an inscription inlaid in it, a very classical Arabic inscription, which says, Nasrun min Allah wa fatun qarib, victory is near, God is with us. But let's leave those early years of Ali Adil Shah behind. We see that certain foundational things happened, but the real magic that came about in Bijapur came with the reign of his son, Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who's one of the great figures of Indian history and Indian art particularly, and world art. He was an extremely talented individual who was a musician, who was a mystic, who was brilliantly enlightened in his thinking, and who loved beautiful things, beautiful art, and he encouraged a complete revolution as far as the arts were concerned in his period. And this is one of the great figures of portraits of his time that shows Ibrahim quite young. He's not even really fully grown out of adolescence, because you can see that he's just got a very light beard. Later on you see that he becomes fully bearded. And the artist who we have attributed, who's done this, and just one other painting that has been convincingly attributed to him, is known, well, he's just known by these two works. And I guess the thing that I would like to point out as well is this extraordinary turban that you see here. I had talked a little bit about the continuation of medieval Hindu South Indian practice in the Deccan courts. And this broad band that was worn on the turban by the Bijapur rulers is really something that Daud Ali has shown was a very important feature of medieval Hindu kings. It was a band that was put on during specific ceremonies, especially coronation ceremonies, and one quite imagines that this could be a very important occasion on which Ibrahim was portrayed with this band. What's interesting about the band, though, is that while it derives from Indic tradition of the South, you see that it's got these little lozenges which actually have Persian verses in there, and the Persian verses that are quoted are from the Saqi-name of Hafiz, and they've been slightly altered to give Ibrahim the qualities of King Solomon, the perfect king for the Muslims in many ways. Now Ibrahim is growing older. You can see that he's a handsome young man in this famous picture. And when I say famous picture, again, I'm just stressing how rare these pictures are. The known corpus of images of Ibrahim has not significantly expanded, even though we've been doing our best to hunt them down. Where are they? There must have been so much more. The survival of Deccan court art is one of the most, it's so limited that it makes it one of the rarest categories of art to study anywhere in the world. Much more material in Safavid, Ottoman, or Mughal art that survives. But let's look for a moment at this famous picture, because this is the sort of fully mature, absolutely sensuous style that was associated with Bijapur, with Ibrahim. The lyricism, the movement, again, the monumentality of the human form, the arrangement of figures that recalls even the classical frescoes of Ajanta, even though there's a 1,000-year gap between the two. It's almost a continuation of a sensibility. You see Ibrahim in procession with his people, his courtiers behind him. Very portrait-like treatment of each of those faces. Ibrahim holds a small spray of narcissus flowers at his face. The idea of fragrance being associated with kingship. He also wears 4 strings of Rudraksha beads, because Ibrahim was a great devotee of the goddess Saraswati, and in fact Bijapur state is a variation of Vidyapur, or knowledge, one of the attributes of goddess Saraswati. So he was very eclectic in his religiosity, and we see him walking in this kind of fully formed, magnificent style. But there's a mystery to this picture, which was first noticed by the great art scholar Robert Skelton, who pointed out that somebody else was standing next to Ibrahim. And if you look carefully, you see that there's a little bit of an unexplained textile. And because this painting hadn't been seen for many, many years, no one had had a chance to really study it until I managed to find it, and we managed to borrow it for the exhibition. And we saw that, excuse me, we saw that indeed something's been cut out here. This is all newly done, where I don't know if you can make, there's a little line. Everything to the right here, all of this area, has been repainted and inserted. Excuse me, just... Thank you. Thank you so much. So the question is, what's going on? Well, we turn to another painting that came to light, a painting that's been attributed to painter A, who was one of the painters involved in the Nujum ul-Ulum. This painting seems to be based on this painting somewhat, because you can see that the figure of Ibrahim is very similar here. This, for various reasons, mainly stylistic, is likely to have followed this one rather than the other way around. But you can see clearly that there's a female figure standing next to Ibrahim, and the way that her skirt, her clothes stick out, and that's it, you can imagine that quite possibly next to Ibrahim in this picture, in the cut-down picture, was also the same female figure, and she is most likely to be his girlfriend, who was the dancing girl Ramba, about whom quite a lot is known in the court sources, but who, for various reasons, seems to have been, cut out of the picture quite literally in the original, but whose presence we can deduce from the later version. So it was interesting to be able to do this detective work and point out this interesting feature about the painting. Now, Ibrahim also drew to his court one of the most famous artists in Indian art, whose name was Farrukh Hussain. He was born in Iran, and he came to the court of Ibrahim via the court of the Mughals, both in Kabul, where Akbar's brother Mirza Hakim was based, and then to the court of Akbar, down to the Deccan, where his style completely changed into the most extraordinary expression, and then back up to the court of Jahangir, where he was reintroduced after he left Bijapur. He left just 7 paintings that have been attributed to Bijapur, and they are extraordinary paintings. This one, further away from me, that show the elephant of Ibrahim Adil Shah, whose name was ʔAːj.aːŋ Khan, and the elephant's mate, whose name was Chanchal. And these two were a couple, just like, and this artist was incredibly sensitive to the fact that they were together, because look at the demure and shadowy presence. She appears in another painting as well by Farrukh Hussain. He must have been especially sensitive to them because the Mughal emperor Akbar had demanded Chanchal as an offering, and his ambassador Asad Beg was in the Deccan in 1604, and very, very reluctantly Ibrahim had to part with this female elephant, who had to then be separated from her mate ʔAːj.aːŋ Khan, and she had to take the long walk up to northern India with Asad Beg, the ambassador. And Asad Beg's account of that journey says that Chanchal was so heartbroken at having left her mate and her home that she couldn't be consoled with anything. And finally he found that the only thing that worked was gallons and gallons of Portuguese wine. And and we can actually date this painting to 1604 because that was the year that Chanchal was sent off to northern India. But I just think it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, you have to enter the mind of this artist who came to India, from Iran, didn't know what the emotional life of elephants was. We know it very well in India, but how he captured it through this poignant and sweet painting, which shows he's not really interested in the Sultan who's sitting up there. The subject of this painting is really the elephants in their fantastical setting, which is another hallmark of Farrukh Hussain's work. He also portrayed Ibrahim playing his musical instrument, and Ibrahim left a famous text called the Kitab-e-Nawras, in which he talks about his elephants and his musical instrument. And here's the extraordinary song that's being illustrated in that painting, where Ibrahim actually declares himself to be the son of Ganesh and Saraswati. Oops, excuse me. Just to point out, since you see the song actually mentions the red nails, and you can see that in the painting, there's very delicately shown tiny little red nails, and you know, just the subtle kind of connections to the song that you see. I'm just going to move on a little bit in the interest of time. These are illustrations from a copy of the Kitab-e-Naras. But staying with the idea of Ibrahim as a devotee of Saraswati, this famous painting in the British Museum shows Ibrahim as a grown man now. You can see that his beard is fully come in. And by the way, one of the interesting things is that Ibrahim looks slightly different in all of his paintings. In the Mughal Karkhana, in the Mughal tradition, there was much more faithfulness, you could say, to imagery or to the portraiture, and you can more or less recognize people as they go through time. But in the Deccan, there was much more of a tendency to stylize figures, and so Ibrahim looks a little bit different here, but he's holding clappers, the kind of clappers that you find, or castanets that you find that are used in the singing of bhakti in temples. So there, we have a close-up of this. And again, what an extraordinary painting. I mean, if you dwell for a moment just on its visual qualities, on that serene look, on the enigmatic setting of a night garden, of the darkness and the way the trees are done, on pointillistic, psychedelic, it's all very, very imaginative. It's very different from the logic of the Mughal tradition. It's very different from the formality of the Persian tradition. It's its own thing. It's the Deccan imagination. And that's what makes these works of art so arresting. Another famous painting, and also tells you something about Ibrahim's period, is this portrait, is image of the Sufi saint and a visitation to the Sufi saint. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep moving a little bit faster. So I should just mention that one of the things that we thought about is that we have all these Europeans, as I mentioned, around the Deccan, and yet there isn't the kind of European influence in the painting style that you would expect, and has been quite well absorbed in the northern style. In the Akbar period, by the end of the 16th century, European influences and techniques had been well learnt by many of the Mughal artists. But in the Deccan, there was a sort of a resistance to the kind of openness to specific European techniques. Rather, the artists used to respond in a much more unusual way. We discovered that this print, which is by a European artist named Adrian Collard, it's a study, it's a set of prints that show different birds. You can see that there's one bird here and one bird here, two birds on individual branches. And the purpose of these was really to show the wonders of nature in the original context. Somehow this print clearly made its way to the Deccan, because you can see quite clearly that this bird flew into this painting and this bird flew into this painting. But in both instances, the birds are rather large. They're completely out of scale with the rest of the painting. And so there's a much more direct quotation and not really an effort to adapt to scale in the way the Mughal atelier was practicing. The famous Yogini, you who know her well, she's many posters, many reproductions of this painting. But what you may not know is that one of the things about this rather enigmatic landscape that this famous Yogini walks in are these rather large, out-of-scale plants. That is a lotus that should be growing out of water, but it's actually growing out of the ground. This is a peony. Where do these images come from? Again, they might be directly quoted from Chinese sources, Chinese ceramics or textiles that were in the Deccan at the time. And again, we have this phenomenon of quoting from another source, but not adjusting it to scale. And so you have this kind of strange, enigmatic look that comes about in the painting. Just flipping you through some fantastic images as we go through Bijapur, just so that you can enjoy them. This is Ali Adil Shah II. I'll be talking a little bit about this painting in a bit. This was a new discovery, some fantastically decorated paintings, calligraphies. Believe it or not, this is cut and paste work. This is the finest example of decoupage that we have seen from the Deccan. Marbled paintings, another great Deccani technique. And finally, a great response to landscape in this masterpiece, which shows the last of the Bijapuri Sultans in a landscape. Now, I'm moving on to the next kingdom, which is Bidar. And this is the Rangeen Mahal in Bidar, which has, that's the setting. I don't know if any of you have ever visited the Rangin Mahal. It was originally part of the Bahmanid, one of the capitals of the Bahmanids, and then in the 16th century it was taken over by the later sultans and added to. And one of the things that was added to was this fantastic wooden architecture in the Rangin Mahal. And when you look up, I was absolutely stunned and insisted that for our catalogue, we absolutely published this extraordinary ceiling very, very well, because what you're looking at is South India meets Iran, okay, essentially, in terms of its aesthetic. Because this beautiful woodwork, those heavy pendentives, the pillar and column style is a very local style. But if you look at those arabesques and the way that they've been, the tightness and the way that they've been articulated, it's high Timurid style. And so these two styles have come together in these architectural places, and also in the great product of Bidar, which is Bidri ware. Golconda is the home of diamonds. And I'd just like to point out that the world's diamonds, Golconda was the source for all the world's diamonds until the 18th century, when Brazil and African diamonds became known. And what you can see here is a Roman ring. That here is actually a Roman ring, which has a very tiny Golconda crystal in it. And this is a much larger taviz made of pure diamond, cut and slightly faceted, which was possibly owned by Shah Jahan at some point, but comes from Golconda. What's the difference between this and this? Well, there's about 1,500 years where diamonds were basically, or 1,000 years, let's say, where diamonds were basically not known and mentioned, and that's a big mystery and something that we hope to fill as we continue our research. But also you can see that there's a great difference in scale. The diamonds here are just tiny octahedral crystals, which is a natural form, naturally occurring form of diamonds. And in the Roman period, early diamonds were just set into rings like this. Later on, they were able to get larger diamonds out of the mines, and you had the extraordinary bonanza of diamonds that became the world's most famous diamonds. But honestly, we don't know of a great big diamond before the reference to the Kohinoor diamond, which one story of it says that it belonged to the Kakatiya rulers of the Deccan. Just some more famous diamonds from the Deccan. I'll just keep moving. I'm going a little bit faster here because I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I hope somebody will signal to me when the time is up. But I couldn't resist sharing these wonderful images because these are so extraordinary. This is a very interesting piece. This is a tiny drawing, but it's monumental again in its idea. It is a throne verse from the Quran, expressed here in the form of a horse. This is something that you might see if you go to Hyderabad today, sort of commercially, people selling things, souvenirs, calligraphy in the shape of this animal or that animal. But that idea was actually born in the Deccan. And why? What does it mean for this throne verse to take on the shape of the horse is something that we've speculated on. This is related to ideas of Sufism, and also the blue lapis and the gold together quotes the traditional style of Quranic illumination that is favored in Islamic courts around the world. But the brilliance doesn't just stop in 2 dimensions. To me, these are some of the most extraordinary pieces anywhere, because they are 3-dimensional calligraphic works. This is the head of a dragon from the side of a small alam or standard, and this is the famous hawk that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum that you would have seen reproduced many places, and that's also part of this great calligraphic tradition which takes animal forms or natural forms and fashions calligraphy around them. The question still remains, what is the full meaning of these forms? And if there are any students who want to explore that as an idea, I think it's a very good idea, a very good area for further research. That just to give you an idea of where those dragon heads come from in alams. So you can imagine what that whole alam would have looked like if it was still complete. Now, since we've talked a little bit about Hindu-Muslim relations at Bijapur, I should point out that one of the Qutb Shahi, one of the famous romances in the Qutb Shahi tradition is between one of the Qutb Shahi sultans, Muhammad, and his young Hindu bride, Bhagmati. This is a kind of legendary story, but this is one of the paintings a great masterpiece by an anonymous artist, which is supposed to actually illustrate, sometime after the fact, the legendary romance between Muhammad and Bhagwati, after whom, in fact, the city of Hyderabad is supposed to be named. And there you see, it's very easy to understand the ideas when you just stop to think for a moment. There he is on his horse. There she is, very young, sitting on the horse in front of him. That's in itself amazing. Her dolly is back there, empty. Her attendants are in there. She's been moved here. Behind them are two figures, and they might be her sisters, who often, in Andhra Pradesh, I'm told that there are ceremonies to the present day where the bride is often followed by her sisters, who carry thalis with specific ceremonial objects on them. But really, the whole element that's so great about this painting, that makes it such an extraordinary painting, is the night setting and the rich infusion of romance and idealization of this relationship, and the mystery that comes about with the night setting. This is something that's very, very extraordinary. The painting is now in the collection of a great collector who loved it, even though it was very badly damaged, because he felt that its great qualities survived any kind of damage. I'm going to keep going, because we need to get by towards the end of our presentation. You've had a view of the courts of the Sultans. We're back to our map here. I want to dwell briefly on the Marathas and then talk a little bit ending on the Europeans, who are also associated with art production in the Deccan. Now, these are very familiar images to us, because you see one in the Prince of Wales, one similar to this as soon as you enter the Prince of Wales Museum, which is a big version based on a miniature like this. And these portray Shivaji, who was the founder of the Maratha kingdom. He died in 1680, and he was based in the Western Deccan, and came into contact with the Bijapur Sultans, who were closest to him physically, and the Deccan rulers, as well as the Mughals, in various ways over his career. The interesting thing is that if you think of it in terms of regional developments, his great devotion to this was to the region, and he was also under pressure, as were the Bijapur Sultans, from the Mughal enemy in the north. And so the alliances that he struck were quite frequently with the Bijapur Sultans against the Mughals. Now, because of Shiva, we don't know of any paintings or objects that are associated with Maratha patronage in this early period. So these images that we see of Shivaji are usually made following a lost original that was probably made in the Golconda tradition. We judge that from the style of them, but was also had quite an afterlife in European bazaar painting, because the Europeans were getting, the famous Whitsun album at the Rijksmuseum, for example, is an example of the kind of European paintings that were being made at a commercial level, which showed many, many, many images of rulers. And so he was shown as one of many rulers in these albums. I think that's, excuse me. That's actually from the Rijksmuseum. That one's actually from the Rijksmuseum album. And you can see that and that, they all seem to be based on something that we don't really have it with us anymore as evidence. But what we do have that's interesting, and here I'd like to point out the scholarship of Pushkar Soni, who did a very interesting presentation on the patronage of architecture from Shivaji's ancestors, and his mother's family in particular were quite active patrons of architecture. And what was interesting is that this is a tomb from one of the figures of Shivaji's ancestry, and you can see that the style in which it is constructed is, virtually indistinguishable from the style that the Adil Shahi rulers were building in. This is just one of many, many examples that can be shown. In other words, what I guess you can determine from the evidence that survives in terms of the architectural record is that there were tremendous exchanges stylistically and aesthetically between the Maratha patronage of architecture in this period and the Adil Shahi Sultans of that period. Now, I'm going to sort of take you for a brief moment into the world of the Mughals, because we've looked at the Sultans, we've looked at the Marathas, The ones who we haven't looked at, again, it's a very rare category of material that really needs to be expanded. But what were the Mughals doing? Where were they? What was happening up there? So as you might know, that the Mughals always had a Deccani policy from the time of Akbar. Akbar signed treaties with the Deccan, but he never formally conquered the region. It was only in the period of Aurangzeb that they actually succeeded in conquering the region. But, and why did they want to conquer it? For the diamonds, for the wealth, for all the reasons that you've seen. But also it was because they had failed to conquer their ancestral homelands, which were further into Central Asia. And we know that they had a two-pronged kind of expansion idea, which failed incredibly badly on one side, and so they were forced to press further down into southern India. And Aurangzeb spent 25 or 26 years of his life in the northern Deccan, determined to make this conquest, to complete this conquest. But very little survives from his period, or from any period, whether it was Shah Jahan, who was in Burhanpur initially, or Aurangzeb, who was in Aurangabad. But what's fantastic is that one great painting does survive, and this is a large one. It shows Aurangzeb as a prince. He served twice as Subedar of the Deccan as a prince before he became emperor. And this large painting on cloth shows him as a very young, very determined man. And it's a great, great masterpiece and a very rare thing. It's one of the most spectacular images because it's so large. And I'm just going to show you the quality of that painting. You can see how each of the hair on his beards is delineated, those wonderful little curls. There's even a little whirl of hair at the base of his neck. Each eyelash, eyebrow, there's even a distant eyelash on that side. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderfully detailed, but very, very strong image at the same time. One of the discoveries that we made was of a tomb, a fully painted Mughal tomb in Burhanpur, which in some miraculous way hadn't been discovered until it just recently came to light. And we sent our photographer, Antonio Martinelli, to take pictures within the tomb because we were so surprised and thrilled to find that this tomb, which was the tomb of one of Shah Jahan's son's wives, one of Aurangzeb's sisters-in-law, if you like, was completely covered with original wall painting. And when we looked at the style of the wall painting, we saw that it was Kanat textile panels. They were basically painted like the inside of a tent. And suddenly, the surviving tent pieces that you see, this is a very rare, again, kalamkari panel from the northern Deccan in our collection at the Met. Its mate is in Honolulu, and absolutely nothing else in this style survives. But look at the style that you see here and the fully painted decoration on that extraordinary interior. You really get a sense of how lavish the tents and the influence and the exchanges between architecture and tent construction, which was a kind of an architecture in this period, was. This is also interesting because I guess I should just remind us all that the Mughal conquest of the Deccan was not a Hindu, firstly it was not a Hindu-Muslim conquest because the Sultans who were the target of the Mughals, main target of the Mughals, were also Muslim, but many of them were Shiites, so there might have been a little Shia-Sunni conflict, but I can't confirm that. But what's interesting about the Mughal army in the north is that it was itself a multi-faith, multi-cultural alliance between the Mughals and the Rajputs, and many of the famous great Maharajas of Rajasthan were serving in the Mughal army, also part of this great conquest. Raja Anup Singh of Bikaner, Maharaja Jaswant Singh of Jodhpur, among other luminaries. Now, Maharaja Jaswant Singh, when he was in the northern Deccan serving with the Mughal army, had his religious verses or texts actually set into a manuscript, transcribed, and then decorated with very Deccani style decoration, gold backgrounds with these wonderful lively flowers. It brings together Mughal, Rajput, and Deccani sensibilities aesthetically. And this manuscript, which is an absolutely beautiful thing, is one of the only dated manuscripts. I'm saying one. There were a couple of others. This is one of the only dated manuscripts that we can firmly say was made in Aurangabad at the time. And we have to end, so I'm going to say that we will end with the Europeans, because here you have kalamkaris that were made for the Europeans. You have images of this Dutch figure among many others who was in the Deccan at the time. But I'm really going to end with this image because you know that the story ends with the English and their success over all other forces in India at the time. They appear in this painting in the form of Charles II, who appears inserted into a Deccan painting where, the artist illustrates a story which says that it's better to give your bread to a starving dog than to an infidel who appears in the form of Charles II. But the English were there as diamond traders. This is actually a diamond pin, a hairpin that was made for Nell Gwyn, the famous love story between Charles II and his famous mistress Nell Gwyn. And that's a pin that was made of Deccan Golconda diamonds. So between the diamonds and everything else, the English were there. Our history wouldn't have been the same without this whole contact in this period. And so I really leave you with that sense of internationalism, the sense of historical importance, and the fact that the Deccan was a key not just to the history that we have inherited today, but possibly to the history that the world has inherited. Thank you.
Hello? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dear Navina, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
As you were going through the slides, I noticed that there are quite a few pieces of private collection. So the question I have for you is regarding the study of Deccani art from the point of view of museums and institutions. Is there a lot? Is there a lot in museums and institutions already, or are you sourcing a lot from private collections? And since the exhibition of last year, has there been any change in that? Have you expanded the vocabulary and the study now so that museums maybe are looking to acquire Deccani pieces which they had previously not?
Thank you. That's a great question. I have to say that, okay, when it comes to private collections, any scholar of Indian art today has to work with all kinds of sources, including private collections, and some of the greatest works from the Deccan are in fact in private hands. How they got there, who those owners are, that's a whole history in itself. But great art, I mean, I think it's a historical fact. You can say that art moves, portable art moves, and it reflects interest of collectors, it reflects historical realities, it reflects economic realities, and most importantly, I think it reflects tastes. There was a generation of great collectors in India who built up private collections here. Some of the great Deccan works are in their collections, and they have been very generous and allowed us to work. But of course, if it's a private collection, you have to have a relationship of trust and true partnership with the owner who's actually living with these works, who loves these works, and who has quite often saved them from a complete decline or neglect in some ways. The institutions, we have a problem in this country, which is that access to public collections has been very difficult since independence. Not every museum has made it difficult, but many museums have for various reasons. And so you see a generation or two of art historians who tend to study architecture more than art paintings or more than objects. And part of the reason, I think, has been access, limitations on the access. So I'm hoping that will change in the future because I think everything's going much more global now. Museums here are getting much more open. Things are going online. There's no more great mysteries about what's in a museum. So yeah, that I hope is going to be happening now.
Hi, so thank you so much for this presentation. I studied Arabic for about 8 years and Islam in college, and so I'm so excited to hear your pronunciation and see the Arabic, the calligraphy that was built into those gold works was amazing. But so I don't take too much time. My question is, I'm wondering about the entrance of perspective into these art forms. I know a lot of like the Rajasthani miniatures, for example, it's usually the detail is beautiful, but it's all very flat. And if you go to the Umayyad Bhavan in Jodhpur, you can see when all of the different Maharanas, the way the portraits changed over time. You saw more and more perspective enter, and in one or two of those pictures, I saw some more perspective in the portrait. So I was wondering, when did it come in, and was it indigenous? Did it come from Europe? So I was wondering where the perspective came in.
So you mean the roundness and the modeling?
Yes.
Well, when it comes into the Deccan, it's via Mughal influence. Because as I mentioned, European influence doesn't directly seem to have impacted the Deccani artists in the way that it did have an impact on Mughal artists. So what you tend to see is that Mughal influence, that's the root. Now, how it came into the Mughals is interesting, because the Akbar period was incredibly open to outside influences artistically. Akbar was presented with the famous polyglot Bible by the Jesuits. The impact of the prints and the engravings that came with that on the artists was huge. But also you did have, in the Deccan, Bijapur, for example, had a Dutch artist who was serving Ibrahim. We don't have a single work surviving from him. He's known as ʔAːj.aːŋ. He wasn't a single work surviving from him, but his presence is recorded at court. So maybe there was also an exchange there with things that we no longer have. There's been some idea that he might have helped with wall painting traditions, again, which are very badly erased and damaged in places like Kumatgi, which is a water pavilion out in Noraspur. So there is speculation, but I think most of the root was through the Mughal influence.
Thank you. Two aspects in your talk actually intrigued me. When you were speaking about Adil Shah, you said that he was wearing the Rudraksha, probably as a mark of his allegiance to Lord Ganesha.
Mm-hmm.
And in Indian mythology, it's more associated with Shiva. So I was just wondering where that came from. And the second thing you said was that Adil Shah actually called himself as the son of Ganesha and Saraswati. And this again intrigues me, because Saraswati is more a consort of Brahma, and Ganesh is a child of Shiva. So just wondering how this came about.
Yes, I did think about that. I think, so the Kitab-e-Noras is where this information comes from. This is a book of musical songs, 59 songs and 17 couplets that the authorship of which is attributed to Ibrahim Adil Shah II. In song number 59, which is a song that I quoted here, he describes in Dakkani Urdu, he says that Ibrahim is the son, I don't have the original here, I have it in another presentation, but he describes himself as a son of Saraswati and Ganesh. Now, did he think of them as a unified couple? I don't suppose so, because he would have known that in the Hindu tradition they're not on that, they're not related to each other in that way. So it's we are talking about a book of musical songs. We are talking about constructions of sentences and ideas that are within a kind of framework of rhyme and musical sort of character, that maybe that is one of the reasons why we see a kind of slightly odd construction there. But that's, we're quoting the book itself. That's what he said. Bottom line. About the Rudraksha beads, Rudraksha beads are associated today with Shaivism, right? I don't know if 400 years ago they were associated exclusively with Shaivism. We haven't been able to find evidence one way or the other. But again, you see him, you see what he says, and you see him wearing the Rudraksha beads. You actually see a change in his necklace. Actually, the David collection picture that I showed, he wears 4 strings. They're probably either emeralds, or if they're silver foil, it's been sort of darkened, it was probably meant to show diamonds, which wouldn't have surprised us, being that it's the Deccan. But at some point, that same style of necklace changes to the 4 strings of Rudraksha beads, which becomes a very big signifier of Ibrahim in later tradition. He's identifiable quite often just by that type of necklace. So again, it's this question of whether what we know to be tradition today, how it might have changed, from what it was in the past.
Hi. You showed an image of the tomb of Chimkabai, which was, you said, the relative of Shivaji. earlier and compare it
Yes.
with Bijapur style.
Mhm.
So, being a Hindu, why would you have a tomb on that style? Because wouldn't the normal this be cremation rather than
Right.
having a tomb?
Well, it's not just the only tomb. There's a lot of architecture. There's little palace structures. There's water pavilions. There's a number of Shivaji's mother's family were very active patrons of architecture, and this new scholarship that's coming out by this scholar that I mentioned is very interesting because he is looking at, when you talk about style or building a building, you live in your times. I mean, the great exchanges and also techniques that were mastered by builders, by artists, and so you go with what's developed unless you have a great reason not to. But normally you just go with what's being done. So it's just an interesting point that there was a tremendous exchange of stylistic and aesthetic, idioms between the early Maratha patronage of architecture and the Adil Shahi architecture. I mean, I just showed one, and I was taking the liberty of showing somebody else's research because he's actually going to be producing a book very soon, and it'll be very interesting to see these unknown buildings and what they can tell us, what perspective they can shed on these historical figures.
In one of your slides, you showed 4 or 5 examples of Chinese ceramics.
Mm-hmm.
Can you please throw some light on the journey which these ceramics may have taken to this region?
Oh, yes, I'd love to, because actually I'm hoping that some students here will take that up as another research topic, because you can see I've got lots of offers for research. It's just that there was a great deal of Chinese blue and white export wear is a huge subject. It goes across the entire world. It is a huge impact on the Middle East, on Europe, and India is a bit of a question, because there is no great ceramic tradition in India that equates the ceramic tradition of the Middle East and India. People didn't eat off ceramic wares, for example, or for their daily life. It seems that metalwork played the role in the Indian tradition that ceramics played in Middle Eastern and European traditions. But at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of China where Chinese ceramics imported into India at the same time, which haven't actually been studied. What I'm saying right now is the current opinion, but maybe if somebody demonstrated that there was a huge use of Chinese wares, some people have just sort of hinted at it in their work, but a systematic study of absolutely everything, the sources, the ships, the shipwrecks. There's a famous shipwreck at Mantai, and the work has been going on by John Carswell in northern Sri Lanka, which is filled with Chinese ceramics, partly destined for India, partly destined for the Middle East. That work needs to be done, and maybe we will have a new idea about it. But certainly if you go to Bijapur, Golconda, most Indian site museums, you will find there's plenty of Chinese blue and white, as well as celadon ware, as well as other types of Chinese wares that are available to look at, and they date from the 16th, 15th, 17th, 18th centuries. The Mughals, actually, we do know that the Mughals liked Chinese wares as well, because there are at least 4 or 5 inscribed vessels in India which have Shah Jahan and Dara Shikoh and Shah Shuja's names and dates on the back, which is specific to them. So I think it's an area for research, and I can just tell you that there was a lot of Chinese imported into the Deccan, and even today, if you go to a really remote Deccan site, colleagues that I know in the field have walked around and literally found Chinese shards of ceramics on the floor, on their ground, on their feet, that have been lying there for about 400 years. Well, a great deal. I mean, it depends which period and what period you're talking about. But let's say, what period would you be? Well, that's another lecture. But I can tell you that influences go round and round. They don't just go in one direction. There's always exchange, and ideas travel often before art. And India's played a huge role. I mean, you have huge schools of sculpture in the western part of the world that were influenced by India. You have Southeast Asia that was hugely in the ancient period. In this period, you have all kinds of influences that went into the Middle East. Pardon? Sorry? Okay, well, I mean, so much. For example, if you look at Mughal period, Mughals were very much in touch with Europe at the time. There's a tree, for example, sent by the Mughals to Oxford University. There's treasures from, India that went into European collections and influenced things. There are diamonds, there's decorative arts, there's, take textiles. I mean, 60% of the world was clothed in Indo-Islamic textiles from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Kalamkari exports from the eastern coast of India were one of the biggest export items in India at any time. And the export markets that they served were Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Fustat in Egypt, all of Europe. We did a major exhibition called, Encompassing Interwoven Globe, which was done about 3 years ago at the Met. And you could see that most of the export textiles that were done in the period were done in India, in Islamic states, if you like, but involved many, many agents. It's not an exclusively Islamic thing. I mean, you had all kinds of workers, all kinds of tradespeople, all kinds of elements that made it possible for these textiles to travel. So I'm just citing the textile wares, but I could, go into other things as well, decorative arts. Okay, thank you.
What can one say after a lecture like this? And there are so many distinguished scholars in the audience. And Navina, you have opened up a whole new world. I didn't have the good fortune to visit the exhibition at the Met, but I'm sure there were many here who did manage to go, and I'm told it was absolutely spectacular. So I did the next best thing. I got the catalog. And it is a real, it's a masterpiece, the catalog as well. And I'm glad we're ending with Charles II, because what's Bombay all about?
That's right.
And so thank you very, very much for this wonderful presentation. You've taken us on a fantastic journey, and you've given many young people in this room, I think, food for thought, many research papers, new discoveries, I hope, and I hope we'll have many more exhibitions. I'd just like to comment on one thing, since we're sitting right across the CSMVS Museum and the director is here, and someone did ask you the very first question, what happens to loans which you take from India and the difficulty that you face. But there are 2 gems in the museum across the road, and Mr. Mukherjee has asked me to mention them, Chand Bibi in the garden and an Adil Shahi on cloth. So I'm going to suggest to both of you, Mr. Mukherjee and to you, to plan an exhibition in our city. We can't send them abroad, but surely we can see them in our own country. And Mr. Mukherjee, we would like to see these in the museum, and maybe may I take the advantage of inviting Navina to be back with us at that time, maybe for another talk or maybe for a museum exhibition. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving Navina Haider a very big round of applause. That's it. Come from the front. Presents Navina with a memento from the Asia Society. The next program of the Asia Society is on Thursday, the 14th of April at the Hall of Harmony, Nehru Center, for a discussion on the current challenges in the fight against modern-day slavery and human traffic. Different world, but please do join us on the 14th. And Navina, thank you very, very much on behalf of all the organizers for your talk today. Thank you.